Have you ever had absolute certainty about something, and then discovered that it was completely wrong? That strong, almost physical feeling of "I know," even without being able to explain why. Not a hunch. Not a doubt. Certainty. If this has ever happened to you, stay with me until the end, because what you're about to discover might surprise you more than you imagine. At some point in life, we've all blindly trusted an idea, a memory, an interpretation, or even a hunch. Sometimes it's something simple, the conviction that someone lied, that an event has happened before, that a decision was obviously the right one. Other times, this certainty arises in deeper situations, involving fear, expectation, relationships, or important choices. The curious thing is that, when certainty appears, it usually comes before any evidence, and yet it seems unquestionable. Have you ever experienced this? What's most unsettling is realizing that this feeling of certainty doesn't stem from truth itself, but from something much more internal. The human brain is incredibly efficient at creating coherence, even when the data is incomplete. He hates emptiness, detests doubt, and feels deeply uncomfortable when he can't close a story. And that's precisely where one of the strangest phenomena of the brain and human body comes in, the ability to feeling certain without evidence. When this happens, we're not talking about mystical intuition or some inexplicable sixth sense. We're talking about real neurological processes, silent and automatic processes that operate below the level of consciousness. The brain combines memories, emotions, learned patterns, and subtle environmental signals, and in fractions of a second, delivers a ready-made answer. That's it. The problem is that this answer doesn't always correspond to reality. And yet, it seems solid enough to guide decisions, judgments, and behaviors. Perhaps the most dangerous aspect of this false certainty is how much it convinces us that we don't need to question. When we feel certain, the brain relaxes. The search for proof diminishes. Critical thinking shuts down. The internal feeling of security creates the illusion of control, and often that's exactly what we're looking for. After all, living in constant doubt is exhausting. The brain prefers a comfortable explanation to "I don't know." Have you noticed how unsettling uncertainty is? That's why so many people defend wrong ideas with such conviction. That's why false memories can seem more vivid than real facts. That's why hunches gain emotional strength even when there's no objective data behind them. The brain isn't trying to deceive you out of malice. It's trying to protect you from discomfort. However, in this process, the feeling of certainty can become an invisible trap. As you watch this video, you might begin to recognize moments in your own life where this certainty appeared out of nowhere. Small decisions, quick judgments, instant conclusions. Pay attention to these sensations. They say much more about how the brain works than about the external world. And stay with me until the end, because understanding this mechanism completely changes how you view your own convictions. Now, to understand where this compelling certainty comes from, and why it can arise even without any real evidence, we need to enter a territory where the brain reveals its deepest priorities, and that is exactly what we will explore next. And while all of this is making sense in your head, perhaps you're remembering specific moments in your own life when this feeling appeared. That silent conviction that seemed too obvious to question. That inner certainty that didn't come with proof, but still seemed strong, solid, almost impossible to ignore. If any of these situations have crossed your mind now, stop for a second and realize how this phenomenon is more common and more human than we usually admit. If this topic resonates with you, leave a comment below about what has resonated with you the most so far. It could be a personal experience, a memory, or even a question that came up while you were watching. When you comment, you're not just talking to me, you're opening up space for other people to realize they're not alone in these strange feelings of certainty without evidence. That's how this channel becomes a place for genuine exchange, not just information. If this video is making you look at how your own brain works in a different way, it's worth giving it a like. It seems simple, but this gesture helps the content reach more people who are also interested in scientific curiosities, mysteries of the human body, and strange phenomena of the mind. That's how the message continues to circulate, reaching those who may never have stopped to question these internal certainties. Now, if you enjoy this type of reflection, deep, accessible, and based on brain science, subscribe to the channel. This shows that you want to continue exploring these topics with me, that it makes sense to keep investigating together how the human mind constructs the reality we believe we live in. Your participation here is what makes this channel grow and reach more people with this type of content. And stay with me, because understanding why the brain creates this powerful feeling of certainty is just the beginning. From here, things get even more interesting. Now I want to delve even deeper into this subject, because there's something happening behind the scenes in your mind that almost no one notices, and that silently influences how you think, feel, and make decisions every day. When we say that the brain can feeling certain before having evidence, this is neither a poetic metaphor nor rhetorical exaggeration. It is a fairly accurate description of how the human mind operates when it is trying to make sense of the world. The feeling of certainty is a powerful subjective experience. It doesn't appear as an elaborate thought, nor as a step-by-step logical reasoning. It arises as an internal state, a sudden conviction, a strong impression, a clarity that seems to emerge from nowhere. And precisely because it seems so clear, so firm, so immediate, it is often mistaken for truth. But here is the central point. This certainty does not arise from the verification of facts. It arises from the way the brain interprets incomplete signals. The brain doesn't wait for all the information to be available before acting. It doesn't function like a patient judge calmly analyzing evidence. It works like a predictive system, constantly trying to anticipate what's happening to reduce uncertainty and conserve energy. From fragments, a vague memory, a current emotion, a past experience, a learned pattern, it constructs a coherent internal narrative. When this narrative closes, a feeling of certainty appears. Not because it's true but because it makes sense within that internal model. And this is important to understand. This certainty is not mystical intuition, it is not a special gift, and much less a sign of superior intelligence. It is also not stupidity, a moral failing, or a lack of character. It is pure neurobiology. It's the brain doing exactly what it evolved to do: create internal stability in an unpredictable environment. The mind prefers an imperfect explanation to an uncomfortable void. It prefers a quick answer to an agonizing wait. It prefers feeling in control to admitting it doesn't know. The problem begins when we confuse this internal feeling with objective reality. Because, from a subjective point of view, certainty seems solid. It comes with a feeling of security, of closure, of now I understand. And the more intense this feeling, the less we feel the need to question. This is where the phenomenon becomes truly invisible. The brain not only creates certainty, it also reduces the impulse to check it. Questioning is hard work. Questioning requires energy. Questioning opens the door to doubt. And doubt, for the brain, is an unstable state. There is a silent transformation that occurs in this process. The moment we feel certain, the mind changes mode. It stops exploring possibilities and begins to defend the narrative it has constructed. Contrary information is ignored or reinterpreted. Details that don't fit are discarded. Certainty creates a filter. And the more emotionally involved the situation is, fear, expectation, desire, threat, the stronger this filter becomes. Perhaps you've already noticed this in discussions, important decisions, or even quick judgments about people and situations. Sometimes it's not that there's a lack of data. It's that the feeling of certainty arrives first, closes the issue, and prevents the data from entering. This is one of the reasons why so many decisions seem obvious at the moment and absurd later. The brain wasn't seeking the complete truth, it was seeking relief, coherence, and speed. This mechanism has a profound impact on the mindset with which we approach life. It shapes beliefs, sustains convictions, and guides choices that often define entire courses of our journey. When certainty sets in too early, it can limit important transformations. It can prevent necessary revisions. It can trap us in old versions of ourselves, in narratives that no longer serve us, but that continue to seem right because they are familiar. And the strangest, and perhaps most revealing thing is precisely this. The more certain we feel, the less we question. Doubt doesn't disappear because the truth has become clear. It disappears because the brain has decided that enough is enough. That it's time to move on. This isn't worth the cost of continuing to investigate. It's a cognitive shortcut. An efficient shortcut, but dangerous when confused with objective reality. Behind the scenes, the brain is always balancing risk and comfort. It knows that living in a constant state of questioning is exhausting. So it creates shortcuts, patterns, quick conclusions. This works well in many everyday situations. But when this same mechanism is applied to complex, emotional, or ambiguous issues, certainty becomes a convincing illusion. A hidden truth not because it's concealed on the outside but because it's masked on the inside. And that's precisely why this phenomenon is so difficult to perceive in oneself. The feeling of certainty doesn't come with a warning saying, this could be wrong. It comes with the appearance of clarity. It sounds like confidence. It disguises itself as security. And often, it's only questioned when reality hits head-on with concrete consequences. Now I want to delve even deeper into this subject because understanding how this certainty is constructed within the brain completely changes how we view our own convictions. When we begin to realize that not all certainty stems from evidence, something shifts internally. A space opens up for curiosity, for revision. for more conscious choices. And it is at this point that the most interesting revelations begin to appear, showing how the brain prioritizes emotional coherence over factual accuracy, a detail that changes everything in how we understand our decisions and their impact throughout life. And if all of this is resonating with you in any way, leave a comment below. That makes sense to me. Now I want to delve even deeper into this subject because understanding why the brain hates doubt is one of the most important keys to understanding how the feeling of certainty arises even when there is no real evidence. For the brain, doubt is not just a neutral space between two possible answers. It is experienced as a state of internal instability, almost like a continuous warning sign that something is out of control, incomplete, or undefined. And the brain by nature doesn't deal well with that. From an evolutionary standpoint, doubt has always come at a high cost. For much of human history, hesitation could be dangerous. Not deciding quickly meant wasting time, wasting energy, or exposing oneself to real risks. The brain was shaped in environments where acting quickly was more important than acting perfectly. Therefore, it learned to function even with incomplete information, closing off interpretations too early, often before all the data was available. Keeping possibilities open requires effort, consumes mental energy, and keeps the organism in a state of vigilance. Uncertainty also triggers anxiety. When we don't know what's happening, the body reacts. The mind begins to simulate scenarios, anticipate consequences, imagine threats, and look for hidden signs. This constant state of alert is exhausting. The brain interprets doubt as something that needs to be resolved, not as something that can simply exist. The longer the uncertainty persists, the greater the emotional discomfort associated with it. And this discomfort creates an urgency for an answer, any answer. This is where something crucial happens. Faced with doubt, the brain prefers a wrong explanation to no explanation at all. An imperfect answer, as long as it's coherent, is enough to reduce internal tension. It organizes the experience, creates a comprehensible narrative, and restores a sense of control. The absence of an explanation, however, keeps everything open-ended, and this is perceived as a threat. The brain doesn't first ask if the answer is true. It asks if it's sufficient to end the discomfort. That's why certainty has such a calming effect. When we feel certain, something settles down within us. The mind slows down, the body relaxes, anxiety decreases. Doubt, on the other hand, demands continuous effort. It requires attention, review, mental flexibility. This is the basis of a simple but profound idea. Certainty calms, doubt threatens. Not because certainty is necessarily correct, but because it restores a sense of stability that the brain deeply values. This process directly influences our mindset and how we interpret the world. Many of the convictions we hold did not arise from careful analysis or solid evidence, but from the need to alleviate the tension of uncertainty. The mind closes off narratives in order to move forward. And once closed, these narratives are defended as personal truths. Questioning them means reopening an internal state that the brain had already considered resolved. That's why changing your mind is so difficult. It's not just about revising an old thought, but about returning to unstable territory. When a certainty is questioned, the brain reacts as if it were being threatened. It's not just the idea that's at stake, but the feeling of security built around it. This is one of the reasons why so many decisions are defended with such emotional intensity, even when the facts aren't so solid. Throughout life, we learn to associate certainty with strength and doubt with weakness. But, biologically, doubt is simply a more open, costly, and demanding state of processing. Sustaining doubt requires energy, patience, and emotional maturity. The brain, always seeking efficiency, tries to escape this state as quickly as possible. It closes interpretations too early because this saves resources and reduces anxiety. Behind the scenes of the mind, there is a constant negotiation between comfort and truth. Truth is often complex, nuanced, and frequently uncomfortable. It requires time, revision, and a willingness to admit mistakes. Comfort, on the other hand, comes quickly. All it takes is a plausible narrative. All it takes is an explanation that makes emotional sense. All it takes is a feeling of certainty. And that's how the brain resolves the discomfort of doubt, even if it leads to distorted conclusions. This mechanism has a profound impact on the decisions we make throughout life. Many choices are not made because they are the best, but because they resolve uncertainty more quickly. The brain prefers to decide poorly than not to decide at all. It prefers an imperfect answer to prolonged silence. And after the decision is made, the feeling of certainty creates the illusion that it was always obvious, even when it wasn't. Upon recognizing this, something begins to change. We start to view our own convictions more carefully. We begin to realize that immediate certainty may be less of a revelation and more of an automatic response to discomfort. This doesn't mean distrusting everything all the time, but understanding that the human mind wasn't designed to seek absolute truth. It was designed to reduce uncertainty, maintain stability, and allow us to move forward. This perception opens the door to a silent transformation. When we understand the role of doubt, we become more attentive to moments when certainty arises too quickly. We begin to observe our decisions, judgments, and interpretations with more curiosity. We come to recognize that many internal truths are, in reality, temporary constructs created to alleviate emotional tension. Now I want to delve even deeper into this subject because this hatred of the brain for doubt doesn't just explain why we feel certain without proof. It reveals how emotions, memory, and perception work together to construct versions of reality that seem solid, but are often sustained by mental shortcuts. When we begin to see this process in action, it becomes impossible not to question how many beliefs, judgments, and choices have been shaped much more by the need for relief than by concrete evidence. If all of this makes sense to you, comment below. I'm on this journey too. Now I want to delve even deeper into this subject because so far we've talked about how the brain hates doubt and seeks certainty as a way to alleviate discomfort. But there's an even more powerful element at work behind the scenes of this process. Emotions. They not only influence our decisions. Often they are the breeding ground where false certainty is born, grows, and strengthens without us even realizing it. The brain doesn't separate reason and emotion the way we like to imagine. In practice, emotions don't come after thought. They participate in the construction of thought from the very beginning. Fear, expectation, and the desire for control shape how we interpret information, memories, and environmental signals. And when these emotions come into play, the feeling of certainty tends to become much more intense, much more convincing. Fear is one of the strongest triggers. When we feel fear, the brain enters protection mode. It prioritizes speed over accuracy. In this state, questioning is dangerous because questioning takes time. The brain prefers to quickly arrive at an interpretation in order to act, even if that interpretation is incomplete or distorted. Certainty in this context acts as an emotional shield. It reduces anxiety, organizes chaos, and creates the feeling that the threat has been understood. It doesn't matter if the threat is real or imagined. What matters is that the feeling of control has been restored. Expectation also plays a silent but profound role. When we expect something to happen, the brain begins to look for signs that confirm that expectation. It highlights coincidences, ignores contradictions, and fits loose information into a narrative that makes sense. The greater the emotional expectation involved, whether hope, anxiety, or anticipation, the greater the tendency to feel certain too soon. The mind wants to confirm what it has already begun to imagine. And when that happens, certainty arises not as a result of evidence, but as a consequence of expectation. The desire for control completes this emotional trio. Few things bother the brain more than the feeling of not being in control of what is happening. In ambiguous, uncertain, or emotionally charged situations, the brain desperately seeks something it can call an explanation. Certainty offers exactly that, an anchor. It creates the illusion that we understand what is happening even when we don't. And this illusion is comfortable enough to be defended with conviction. That's why the more emotional the situation, the stronger the feeling of certainty tends to be. Personal relationships, important decisions, losses, changes, expectations for the future. All of these create fertile ground for certainties without evidence. In these situations, the brain isn't interested in scientific precision. It's interested in emotional stability. It wants to reduce tension, alleviate anxiety, and keep the internal narrative functioning. This dynamic explains why we often believe in something not because it is true, but because we need to believe. We need to believe in order to continue, to decide, to endure uncertainty, to follow the journey without becoming paralyzed. The phrase may sound uncomfortable, but it accurately describes this mechanism. Sometimes we don't believe because it's true, we believe because we need to. We need that explanation to sustain our mindset at that specific moment in life. Behind the scenes, emotions act like lenses. They don't just create feelings, they shape perceptions. When we are emotionally involved, the brain adjusts its focus. Some details become prominent, others disappear. Reality is filtered through what we feel. And when the emotional narrative fits together, a sense of certainty appears as an internal seal of approval. This has a profound impact on the decisions we make. Many important choices are made in intense emotional states, but are later rationalized as if they were purely logical. The certainty we feel at that moment gives the impression of clarity. Only later, when the emotion subsides, Do we perceive nuances that were previously invisible? Not because they didn't exist, but because the brain had no interest in seeing them. This false emotional certainty also influences how we remember the past. Strong emotions shape memories. They rearrange recollections to make sense within the current narrative. Thus, the brain not only decides based on emotion but also reconstructs the past to justify these decisions. The result is an even greater sense of conviction. It seems we always knew, always understood, always were right. When we begin to understand this process, something changes in how we interpret our own certainties. We realize that many of them are not signs of absolute truth, but emotional responses to complex situations. This does not invalidate our feelings, nor does it transform us into irrational beings. On the contrary, it shows how skilled the human brain is at creating emotional stability amidst chaos. This realization can be transformative. It opens up space for a more flexible, more curious, less defensive mindset. Instead of immediately asking, "Is this true?" we begin to ask, "What am I feeling that is leading me to be so certain?" This simple shift in focus reveals hidden layers of our own decisions and judgments. Now I want to delve even deeper into this subject because understanding the role of emotions in constructing certainty leads us to an even more intriguing territory, the point where emotion, memory, and perception blend to create experiences so compelling that they seem like objective facts. It is at this intersection that some of the most impactful revelations emerge about how the brain constructs what we call reality, and how often this reality is simply the best emotional story available at that moment. And if this reflection is resonating with you, comment below. That makes sense to me. Now I want to delve even deeper into this subject, bringing it all into extremely familiar, almost intimate territory, because false certainty doesn't just reside in abstract theories or distant scientific concepts. It appears in everyday life, in the small phrases we think, in the quick conclusions we draw, in the silent decisions that shape our journey without us even realizing it. It is in daily life that this phenomenon shows its true impact. Think about that common situation where you look at someone and feel, with absolute conviction, "I know that person lied." There was no concrete proof, no clear contradiction, no verifiable fact. Even so, the certainty arises whole, ready, almost physical. The tone of voice, a look, a tiny detail was enough for the brain to construct a complete narrative. And from then on, everything is interpreted in light of this conclusion. Every word the person says seems to confirm the lie. Every gesture becomes evidence. The certainty not only appears, it begins to feed on itself. Or that unsettling feeling, "I'm sure something bad is going to happen." Nothing has happened yet. There are no objective signs. But the body reacts as if the danger were real. The heart races, the mind revisits negative scenarios, attention is fixated on possible threats. The brain, guided by fear and expectation, transforms possibilities into predictions. And the longer you remain in this emotional state, the more solid this certainty seems to become. Not because the future is set, but because the mind needs to prepare for something it feels is inevitable. There's also that strange and disconcerting experience of false familiarity. You enter a place, experience a situation, or hear a phrase and think, "This has happened before." The feeling is so strong that it's hard to ignore. It seems like a real memory but too vague to be pinpointed. The brain recognizes patterns, connects fragments of memory, creates an illusion of repetition. The certainty appears, "I've already lived this." Even when, rationally, you know it doesn't make sense. These situations are more common than we like to admit. They happen because the brain doesn't just work with facts, but with meanings. He interprets the world based on past experiences, present emotions, and future expectations. When these elements align in some way, a sense of certainty emerges as a final product. It's not a logical conclusion, but an internal construct that seems too convincing to be questioned. What's most curious is realizing how these certainties influence our decisions. After concluding that someone lied, you change your posture, your confidence, your openness. After feeling that something bad is going to happen, you withdraw, protect yourself, avoid risks. After believing that something has happened before, you begin to interpret the experience as predictable, known, almost inevitable. In all these cases, certainty shapes behavior before any evidence appears. Behind the scenes, the brain is always trying to anticipate the world. It prefers to err on the side of overcertainty than to remain stuck in doubt. Anticipating gives a sense of control. Even when the anticipation is negative, it offers an emotional framework. If I know what will happen, I can prepare myself. Objective truth takes a back seat. What matters is reducing the discomfort of uncertainty. This dynamic explains why we often look back and realize that many certainties have simply dissolved over time. That person wasn't lying. Nothing bad happened. The feeling of familiarity was just a momentary alignment of patterns. But at the moment they arose, these certainties seemed unquestionable. They seemed obvious. They seemed true. This happens because the brain doesn't register these certainties as hypotheses. It registers them as conclusions. By recognizing these examples in everyday life, something begins to change. We start to observe our own reactions with more curiosity. Instead of automatically accepting every certainty that arises, we begin to notice the emotional context in which it appears. Were we afraid? Anxious? Too hopeful? In need of control? This change of perspective does not eliminate certainty, but it weakens its absolute dominance. It opens up space for reflection. This is a subtle yet profound shift in mindset. Instead of reacting to internal convictions as if they were absolute truths, we begin to see them as signals. Signals of emotional states, internal needs, narratives that the brain is trying to sustain at that moment in the journey. This changes the impact of decisions. It makes choices less automatic, less defensive, more conscious. And when we begin to realize how many of these certainties arise without any real proof, an inevitable question appears. Not as an accusation but as an invitation to reflection. How many of these convictions have guided your judgments, your attitudes, your most important choices? How many internal narratives have you believed simply because they made emotional sense at that moment? Now I want to delve even deeper into this subject because these everyday examples are just the tip of the iceberg. Behind them lies an even more intriguing mechanism, where the brain creates patterns, connects coincidences, and transforms chance into meaning. It is at this point that the boundary between perception and reality begins to blur, and it is precisely there that some of the most surprising revelations about the human mind begin to emerge. And if you recognized yourself in any of these situations, comment below. That makes sense to me. Now I want to delve even deeper into this subject because after looking at these everyday certainties, there's an even more fascinating and unsettling mechanism happening behind the scenes of the mind. The brain is a pattern-making machine that he wasn't designed to observe the world neutrally, waiting for the truth to reveal itself. He was shaped to connect the dots, even when those dots don't belong in the same diagram. From the very first moments of our existence, the brain learns by associating. Sounds, images, sensations, emotions, and memories are linked together to form internal maps of the world. These maps help us navigate reality more quickly. The problem is that the brain doesn't differentiate with as much precision as we imagine between real patterns and apparent patterns. For it, what matters is that the connection makes sense internally. And when it makes sense, a feeling of certainty appears. Coincidences are fertile ground for this. Two events close in time, an occasional repetition, an improbable sequence. All of this can be interpreted as a sign of something bigger. The brain hates pure chance. It prefers to believe that there is a hidden logic behind events. Thus, it connects independent facts as if they were parts of the same story. The more emotionally striking the coincidence, the stronger the impression that there is a pattern there. Bodily sensations also come into play. A tightness in the chest, a chill in the stomach, a sudden tension. The brain doesn't treat these sensations as noise. It tries to explain them. It searches the environment for something that justifies what the body is feeling. If it finds any minimally compatible element, it connects the two. The sensation becomes evidence. The evidence becomes narrative. The narrative becomes certainty. All of this happens in seconds without passing through the conscious filter. Incomplete memories complete the puzzle. The brain rarely retrieves memories as they actually happened. It reconstructs. It fills in gaps. It adjusts details so that the past makes sense in the present. When a fragmented memory encounters a similar situation, the brain glues the two things together. Familiarity arises. The impression of repetition arises. The certainty that this has happened before arises, even when it never happened that way. What's most intriguing is realizing that, for the brain, coherence is more important than precision. It doesn't seek truth like a scientist seeks data. It seeks a story that resonates emotionally. A narrative that explains what is being experienced now with the least possible cost. That's why the phrase makes so much sense. The brain doesn't seek truth. It seeks consistency. When a sequence of events fits into a comprehensible narrative, the brain relaxes. Even if this narrative is built on fragile assumptions, isolated coincidences, or distorted memories, it fulfills its main function, to organize experience. The feeling of certainty arises precisely at the moment when everything seems to fit together. Not because it's true but because it has become coherent. This mechanism has a huge impact on how we perceive reality. Many of our deepest beliefs are born from this pattern matching. A significant event, followed by another, interpreted in the light of intense emotion, reinforced by an incomplete memory. Little by little, the brain constructs a story that explains how things are. And the more times this story is reactivated, the more solid it seems. This directly affects our decisions. When we believe we see clear patterns, we feel we are anticipating the future. We think we understand the rules of the game. This gives a powerful sense of control. Even when we are wrong, conviction pushes us to act firmly. The mind prefers a decision based on an illusory pattern to no decision at all. The feeling of movement is more comfortable than the paralysis of doubt. Behind the scenes, this process is constantly reinforced. Every new coincidence is interpreted as confirmation. Every detail that doesn't fit is ignored or reinterpreted. The brain adjusts perception to protect the narrative you've built. Not out of stubbornness but out of efficiency. Maintaining a coherent story requires less effort than dismantling and rebuilding it from scratch. This is one of the reasons why certain certainties survive for so long, even when reality offers contrary signs. Questioning a pattern means accepting that perhaps it never existed. It means admitting that decisions were made based on illusory connections. For the brain, this represents instability. And instability is avoided whenever possible. Throughout our journey, this habit of creating patterns shapes our mindset. We begin to see meaning where perhaps there is only chance. We begin to attribute intention where there is only coincidence. This doesn't make us weak or naive. It makes us human. The brain does the best it can with limited information and intense emotions. When we begin to understand how this works, something shifts internally. We don't lose the ability to see patterns, that would be impossible. But we gain awareness of how they are formed. We begin to differentiate, little by little, what is evidence from what is emotional fitting. This change is neither immediate nor comfortable, but it has a profound impact on how we interpret reality. Now I want to delve even deeper into this subject because understanding how the brain creates patterns where none exist leads us to even more delicate territory, the moment when these patterns begin to influence judgments, behaviors, and even decisions that change the course of life. It is at this point that the line between perception and illusion becomes thinner, and it is precisely there that some of the most transformative revelations about the human mind begin to emerge. If this part of the conversation resonates with you, leave a comment below. That makes sense to me. Now I want to delve even deeper into this subject because up to this point we've talked about how certainty is born, strengthened, and organized within the brain. But there's a delicate, almost invisible point where this feeling ceases to be merely a natural mechanism of the mind and becomes dangerous not dramatically or obviously, but silently, daily, cumulatively. It is at this point that certainty begins to have a real impact on our relationships, our decisions, and how we see the world. The feeling of certainty is seductive. It brings relief, direction, and the impression that we understand what is happening. The problem is that, when this certainty is not supported by evidence, it begins to distort reality in an almost imperceptible way. The first effect usually appears in judgments. When we are too certain, we judge too quickly. People, situations, and intentions begin to be interpreted from a single angle, as if the story were closed before it was even fully told. How many times do conflicts begin exactly like this? Someone interprets a gesture, a phrase, or an attitude with absolute conviction that there was malicious intent. This certainty sets in before the conversation, before listening, before verification. From then on, everything is filtered through this initial narrative. Even attempts at explanation are seen as confirmation of guilt. The conflict doesn't arise from the act itself, but from the premature certainty about the act. Behind the scenes, the brain believes it's protecting you. It thinks, I understand the situation, now I can react. But in this process, nuances disappear. Contexts are ignored. Alternative possibilities cease to exist. Certainty creates rigidity. And rigidity is fertile ground for unnecessary conflicts, emotional distance, and ruptures that could have been avoided. Bad decisions follow the same path. When we feel certain, the internal sense of clarity reduces the impulse to assess risks. It seems we already know enough. It seems there's no need to wait, investigate, or ask for opinions. Many important choices are made in this state, not because they were well analyzed but because the mind wanted to quickly end the doubt. Later, when the consequences appear, the internal narrative often shifts to justify the decision, instead of questioning the certainty that originated it. There is also a profound impact on irrational fears. When the brain connects emotional patterns and creates a threatening narrative, the certainty of danger can become extremely convincing. The person doesn't feel they are afraid of something improbable. They feel they are reacting to a real threat. The body responds, the mind shuts down, attention is fixed on the risk. And the more that certainty is reinforced internally, the less room there is to question whether that fear makes sense. This dynamic creates a cycle that is difficult to break. Certainty feeds fear, fear reinforces certainty, and both protect each other against any attempt at revision. The brain is not interested in dismantling this structure because it offers a sense of predictability. Even if it is a negative predictability, it is still better for the brain than the emptiness of uncertainty. The most dangerous aspect of all this is that the person doesn't realize they are trapped by certainty. From a subjective point of view, everything seems logical, coherent, obvious. The internal feeling is one of lucidity, not error. That's why the phrase makes so much sense. The feeling of certainty can be more dangerous than doubt. Doubt keeps the mind open. Certainty closes doors. And when it closes doors too soon, it limits learning, growth, and transformation. Throughout the journey, many opportunities for adjustment are lost because certainty set in too quickly. Relationships could have been better understood. Decisions could have been reviewed. Fears could have been questioned. But the mind had already decided it knew enough. The cost of this doesn't appear immediately. It accumulates little by little, in small choices, small departures, small rigidities that shape the mindset. This type of certainty also impacts how we deal with ourselves. When we have absolute certainty about who we are, what we are capable of, or what we will never be, we create internal boundaries that are difficult to cross. The internal narrative becomes identity. And any contrary evidence is ignored. Transformation becomes threatening because it requires questioning old certainties that, for a long time, offered emotional stability. Behind the scenes, the brain is always trying to protect a coherent story about the world and about who you are. Questioning this story requires cognitive courage. It requires tolerating discomfort. It requires accepting that some internal truths may never have been truths, only provisional explanations. But while this revision doesn't happen, certainty continues to operate, silently shaping decisions, conflicts, and fears. Recognizing when certainty becomes dangerous doesn't mean abandoning it completely. It means learning to observe it. Noticing when it appears too strong, too fast, too emotional. It means distrusting not your own capacity to think, but the internal urge for closure. This kind of awareness changes the impact of choices because it creates a small pause between feeling certain and acting on it. Now I want to delve even deeper into this subject because there's an even more intriguing point in this process. The moment when the brain not only creates certainty but actively defends it, even when reality begins to show cracks. That's where even more subtle mechanisms come into play, linked to how the brain protects its own narratives. And it's in this territory that some of the most disconcerting revelations about the human mind begin to emerge. And if this part of the conversation is affecting you, leave a comment below. That makes sense to me. Now I want to delve even deeper into this subject because after understanding how certainty is born, strengthens, creates patterns, and can become dangerous, an inevitable question arises: how can you tell when your brain is deceiving you in real time? Not after everything has passed, not when the consequences have already appeared, but at the exact moment when that strong conviction arises within you, demanding immediate action. The first sign is almost always the immediate and intense certainty it arrives too quickly. There was no analysis, no reflection, no real gathering of information. Yet, the internal feeling is one of absolute clarity. The brain says, "That's it," with a conviction that seems definitive. This kind of certainty is not accompanied by curiosity, but by closure. When the answer appears too readily, too soon, that's not mental efficiency, it's a shortcut. Behind the scenes, the brain likes shortcuts because they save energy. But cognitive economy doesn't always mean success. A conclusion reached in seconds may seem elegant, but it often ignores important nuances. The feeling of immediate certainty is comfortable because it eliminates the effort of investigating. And that's precisely why it deserves attention. Not as an automatic error, but as warning sign. Another clear indication is the lack of concrete data. When you try to explain why you're so sure and realize you're using vague phrases, "I feel it," "it's always like this," "you can tell," "it's obvious," your brain is probably filling in the gaps with assumptions. Real data tends to be specific, verifiable, and locatable. When certainty fails to point to clear evidence, it's relying more on emotional consistency than on facts. This point is delicate because the brain is extremely skilled at creating justifications after certainty has already formed. It constructs retroactive arguments to give the impression that the conclusion was logical from the beginning. But when you observe calmly, you realize that the conviction came first, and the explanation came later. This is a classic sign that the mind is defending a narrative, not investigating reality. The third element, almost always present, is the very strong emotion involved: fear, anger, expectation, desire, anxiety, or the need for control act as fuel for quick certainties. Intense emotions reduce tolerance for ambiguity. They pressure the brain to close the story as quickly as possible. In this state, questioning seems like a waste of time, and doubting sounds almost like a threat. When emotions are running high, the brain doesn't ask, "Is this true?" It asks, "Does this protect me?" If the internal answer is yes, certainty takes hold. Therefore, recognizing the emotional state in which a conviction arises is one of the most important steps in this journey. Not to invalidate the feeling, but to understand the role it is playing in constructing the narrative. There is a subtle shift in mindset when we begin to observe these signs. Instead of fighting against certainty, we begin to observe it. Instead of reacting automatically, we create a small internal space between feeling and acting. This space doesn't eliminate the impulse, but it weakens its absolute dominance. It is in this interval that more conscious decisions begin to form. A powerful insight helps to reorganize all of this. Absolute certainty is often a shortcut for the brain, not a conclusion. This phrase changes how we interpret our convictions. It doesn't say that all certainty is wrong, but it reminds us that the intensity of certainty is not proof of truth. Often, it's just proof of an internal urgency for closure. When this idea takes hold, something silently transforms. You begin to notice patterns in your own reactions. You realize that certain certainties always arise in the same emotional context. You observe that certain themes trigger quick convictions, while others allow for more reflection. This doesn't generate excessive distrust, but awareness. And awareness alters the impact of decisions. This perception also changes our relationship with error. When we understand that the brain uses shortcuts, making mistakes ceases to be a moral failing and becomes a natural consequence of a system that prioritizes emotional efficiency. This opens up space for review, learning, and course correction. The journey stops being about always being right and becomes about seeing things more clearly. Behind the scenes, this process requires practice. The brain doesn't like to be interrupted when it believes it has already solved something. Developing the habit of observing one's own certainty is an exercise in patience and cognitive maturity. At first, it seems artificial. Over time, it becomes a new lens through which to interpret thoughts, emotions, and decisions. This lens doesn't eliminate the discomfort of doubt, but it makes the discomfort more tolerable. Instead of immediately running away from uncertainty, you begin to recognize it as part of the process. And it is at this point that something interesting happens. Doubt ceases to be the enemy and becomes a sign that the mind is still open. Now I want to delve even deeper into this subject, because there's a next level in this journey of perception. The moment when the brain, even in the face of these warning signs, insists on defending certainty at all costs. Understanding why this happens reveals even deeper mechanisms linked to identity, memory, and how we protect our own internal history, and that's where understanding this phenomenon has an even greater impact. If this part of the conversation makes sense to you, write it at the end. I'm on this journey too. Now I want to delve even deeper into this subject because after traversing this entire path, from the initial feeling of certainty to the shortcuts, emotions, patterns, and risks it carries, something inevitably begins to form within us. A kind of reflective silence. A space where that automatic conviction so common in everyday life no longer goes unnoticed. It continues to emerge, but now it leaves traces. And these traces say much more about the brain than about the world outside. Throughout this conversation, it becomes increasingly clear that certainty is not an enemy. It's a tool. A quick response the brain developed to deal with an uncertain, complex, and emotionally charged environment. The problem has never been feeling certain. The problem is confusing the feeling of certainty with the guarantee of truth. When this happens, the mind closes too soon and everything that could be discovered later remains out of sight. There is something profoundly human in this process. The brain wants stability. It wants coherence. You want stories that make sense even if they are provisional. Each certainty that arises carries a legitimate attempt to organize the experience, to reduce internal chaos, to make the journey more bearable. But at the same time, each certainty reveals limits. It reveals shortcuts. It reveals invisible choices made behind the scenes of the mind. When we look more closely at our own certainties, we realize that they say a lot about our mindset at that specific moment in life. They reveal our fears, our expectations, our wounds, our desires for control. They reveal what we are trying to protect or avoid. In this sense, certainty functions almost like a psychological mirror. It reflects the internal state of the brain at the instant it was created. Perhaps that's why some certainties from the past now seem strange, exaggerated, or even unjustifiable. Not because we were naive, but because we were different people at a different stage of our journey with different emotional needs. The brain constructed the best possible explanation with the resources it had at that moment. Over time, resources change, perception expands, and the narrative ceases to hold up. This is not failure. It's transformation. There's a hidden truth here that's rarely spoken clearly. Growing up isn't about accumulating stronger certainties, it's about learning to live better with doubt. Not paralyzing doubt, but conscious doubt. The kind that keeps the mind open enough to revise, adjust, and evolve. The brain by default resists this. It prefers closure. But when we learn to recognize this impulse, we gain something precious: choice. The choice not to react immediately. The choice to observe one's own conviction before acting. The choice to ask, even silently, what exactly is making me feel so certain about this right now? This simple question changes the impact of decisions. It doesn't eliminate mistakes, but it reduces harm. It doesn't guarantee success, but it broadens awareness. And awareness changes everything. Throughout this journey, perhaps the greatest revelation is this: not all certainty is true, but all certainty says something about the brain. It tells you how it works, how it tries to protect you, how it organizes the inner world. When we understand this, certainty ceases to be an absolute authority and becomes a clue. A valuable clue about what is happening inside. This shift in perspective doesn't happen all at once. It builds gradually, in small pauses, in moments of self-observation, in decisions reviewed with more kindness. The impact of this appears over time. Relationships become less reactive. Choices become more conscious. Fears lose some of their power when they are seen as emotional narratives, not as objective threats. And yet, the brain remains the brain. It will continue creating patterns, shortcuts, and certainties. That doesn't change. What changes is how you relate to them. Instead of being carried along automatically, you begin to walk alongside them. Observing, adjusting, learning. This is one of the most subtle and powerful transformations that can happen in the way someone thinks. Perhaps, at this point in the conversation, a memory has surfaced. A situation where you were absolutely certain of something that later proved to be different. A hasty judgment. An impulsive decision. A fear that never materialized. These memories don't appear by chance. They are part of that silent revision process that the brain begins when new perspectives are presented. And that's precisely where this reflection comes alive. Not as theory, but as personal experience. Because, in the end, understanding the brain isn't just about accumulating information. It's about recognizing internal patterns. It's about perceiving what's happening behind the scenes. It's about accepting that many convictions were merely temporary responses to specific emotional states. Now I want to delve even deeper into this subject because there's one last essential point in this journey. What happens when we start questioning our certainties more frequently, and how this alters the way the brain constructs identity, memory, and perception of reality. It's in this territory that everything connects in an even more surprising way. And before we move on, leave a comment below. That makes sense to me. If you've made it this far, it's because this conversation touched a nerve within you. Perhaps an old certainty has been shaken, perhaps a past decision has gained new meaning, or perhaps you've simply begun to look at your own brain with a little more curiosity. Whatever the reason, I'm truly glad you made it this far with me. If this type of content helps you think better, understand the inner workings of the mind, and see your own decisions more clearly, it's worth subscribing to the channel. This journey continues, video after video, always exploring these strange and fascinating phenomena of the human brain in an accessible yet profound way. And if you want to leave a record that you were here until the end, write it in the comments. I'm with you until the end, or, this message was for me. I read them all and I like knowing who is reflecting on this with me. If this conversation resonated with you, please leave a like. It helps the video reach a wider audience and shows that this type of content resonates with people. Now, there's a video over here that perfectly complements this topic. Click on it and continue with me there. This journey still has much to reveal.